And our first speaker is going to be Joe Kemble, Dr. Joe Kemble from Auburn University. And Joe has been with us here before. If you've been to previous tomato schools, we've benefited from his expertise. But we're going to ask him to continue the discussion with keeping them fresh, optimizing shelf life for your tomatoes. So Joe, come on up.
Thank you, Patrick. Good morning. All right, look at all those smiling faces. Excellent. You've all had your coffee, I guess, so you're ready to go. So, all right. Well, let's have a little bit of fun. It's always tough being the first speaker. It's always tough being the speaker right before lunch, which is also me, and also the last speaker of the day. So I've got all the sort of the three prime spots. But as we go through this, I'm going to talk about shelf life, and I'm going to talk about taste and how you can modify that. But if you got some questions, hold them to the end, and I'll try to get to them. So, but I think one of the issues that we run into typically with tomatoes or any vegetable crop that we grow is we're eager. We do everything absolutely right, but we don't handle them properly. Post-harvest care it's like the follow-through in a baseball swing or in a golf swing. So you never stop right here with your golf swing. You always follow through. So one of the areas I think some growers tend to fall down on is they don't do all those things that they could have done to maintain the quality of that fruit. And that's key, obviously, for anybody who's growing for fresh market. Quality is key. Your tomatoes may look good, but if they don't taste good, your consumers may remember that. And obviously you want them to keep coming back to you. And there's some things that we can do about that. One of the things I've noticed, especially with tomatoes, is we tend to either pick too early or we tend to pick too late. So what the difference obviously in that is in ripeness and flavor accumulation in the tomato fruits. How do we figure out when is really the best time to actually pick these varieties? All the varieties we grow, we try to, when we're growing commercially, we always try to get all the things to come off at the same time, but that doesn't always work well. What you typically find is each one is individual. Each one has its own particular characteristics and qualities, so you've got to take that into account when you do harvest it. So, when it comes down to it, there is an ideal point to harvest for each of the particular tomato varieties or any other varieties of anything you grow. So, and I think this is one of those areas that we need to pay more attention to because, like I said, quality is king in the fresh market. Most of you, who in here sells retail? You sell directly to your consumers. Yeah, and obviously you're meeting them, they're seeing you, they're going to remember. And obviously the thing is, though, people tend to remember a bad experience better than they remember a positive experience. So, we never want them to have a bad experience, or if they do, we want to do something to correct that and hopefully improve things. All right. Where does taste come from? Taste is subjective for individuals. There's some things that we find appealing. There's some things that we don't like. However, there are some things that are somewhat objective in taste, and I'll talk to you about those in a second. So, and when it comes to taste, normally we're thinking about the maturity of the fruit, and we're thinking about the ripeness of the fruit, how close it is to having that peak flavor. So how do we sort of balance these things? Because obviously the more ripe a fruit is, the shorter its shelf life is. So a lot of you may pick and you're going to be selling that day, but within the case of tomatoes, typically we have so much time that we can actually put them in storage, and it could be a week to 10 days, but we can actually hold those over for marketing. So if we have to, and to do that correctly, we have to make sure that we pick our tomatoes at the right point. All right. Maturity this is probably a lot more complicated than you want it to be. This little part. This is sort of a nice table talk. You can go around and tonight dinner time, you can tell everybody how what the difference between maturity and ripeness is in tomatoes. So it's but maturity in the tomato typically deals with the point where the fruit can be picked and it will develop. It will ripen on its own, detached from the plant. You'll follow that? Because there's a stage in tomatoes called mature green. So, and mature green means normally with a tomato, and I'm not talking about breakers. We all know what breakers typically look like. You get that little flush of color in the blossom end. But for a mature green tomato, typically when you look at the base of it, it'll be somewhat clear, or it'll be whitish in kind of color. It depends on the variety you're dealing with. So, but when you pick that tomato, it will mature and ripen on its own without being attached to the plant. Obviously, you don't have the advantage of getting a lot of all those extra chemicals that would tend to accumulate in that fruit, but that's sort of what relies, like when we look at tomato markets in Florida and we look at them in California, they harvest all their tomatoes mature green. They take them, they put them into a room, they gas them with ethylene. It's a ripening enzyme or hormone, and it causes them to mature and to ripen fully. So obviously, you don't get the taste that you like to get out of it. So, but there's also something called a knife test with mature green tomatoes. So what you do is you take a tomato and you slice it. You think it's mature green, you slice it in half, so along the long axis of along the flat side of it. So, and you open it up and you look at it. So if you have a lot of locular gel in there and your knife did not cut any seeds, the fruit's probably mature green at that point. If you cut your fruit in half and you actually end up slicing the seeds and you don't see any locular gel in there, it's not mature green, it's immature green. So that's sort of an important distinction to know. So in tomatoes, maturity usually refers to this. So not necessarily ripeness, that's actually a sort of a different concept. So, and with fruit quality and flavor, there are a lot of attributes that actually do affect it. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, but fruit color is not always the best way to determine ripeness in fruit. We have a lot of fruit that are not red. We have a lot of varieties that come in a whole host of tomato colors. So how do you figure out when the best time to actually pick those is? You know, when we talk about heirlooms, there are a lot of unusual colors that we typically deal with. So, you know, so there's a lot of other factors we have to try to take into account with that. For wholesale, retail, whatever we're doing, you just have to make sure you maintain that quality. That's what you're hoping to do, you know, ultimately, you know, so you don't want to lose your money at the tail end of your production when you've had great production and everything, so, and then you sort of fall down on the flavor side. When it comes to tomato qualities, there's a lot of things that actually make up tomato quality. Size, shape, and color is probably the most typically identifiable by you. You know, so each variety that you grow has a unique shape. It tends to have a predictable shape. So when you're looking at the maturity in a tomato, you want to make sure that tomato looks like it's supposed to look. You know, if it's undersized or if it's lopsided or it's got some other particular problems, there's an issue in there, and that issue could very well actually affect the flavor of the tomato itself. So defects or diseases, so the next thing, they will affect flavor. You know, so a tomato obviously with blossom end rot doesn't taste right. You know, it's going to typically have an off or a musky kind of taste to it. So obviously that's not something you want. So texture. Each variety that you grow typically has a normal, you know, a texture that you expect for that particular variety. So firmness, you know, when you grip the fruit, you know, does it give to you when you're pushing into it? So obviously the more ripe the fruit gets, you know, it tends to get easier to push it in. You know, there's less firmness in there. So that tends to change as the fruit matures. Mealiness is usually a condition where, you know, you cut it open and the inside of the texture is just sort of loose, not very good. The issue with that is typically mealiness is usually a very good indicator of being overripe. However, there are some tomato varieties, some heirlooms, that produce mealy texture. You know, they're just like that naturally. So that's, again, where you sort of have to know the attributes of what you're trying to grow. You may grow it and go, what did I do wrong? And you may not have done anything wrong. That's simply the variety. All right. And, of course, juiciness. So we want a nice, juicy tomato. So composition. When we look inside the fruit, we've got sugars, we have acids, aromatic volatiles. That sounds very fancy, but the aroma, what you smell in that tomato, your smell as a human being influences your taste greatly. You know, so we do blindfold tests, blind tests with people. So, and what we find is when we take the eyes out of the equation, they tend to be much better tasters. They tend to be a lot more objective in their tasting. So between the eyes and the nose, that influences our taste. And that's where the subjectiveness sort of comes in. Some say, I really love this tomato. And you've probably met that. You know, you may have a husband, wife, significant other. They love this particular tomato. And then you try going, this is awful. I really don't like it. That's the subjective part of it. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. The sugar-to-acid ratio, you've probably heard that mentioned before. That's sort of an important part of the attributes as well. But these attributes change as the fruit ripens, and they impact flavor. So that's so flavor is not just one thing. Flavor is actually made up of a lot of different things. But we're going to talk more about that here. All right. You've all probably seen tables like this, and some of us, I mean, you'll use it almost like the Bible saying, you know, I'm looking, for example, you know, when you look at a table like this, you see yellow or white, we always say it's mild. You know, people say, oh, you know, if you have a lot of problems with acid, you don't like acid tomatoes, grow a yellow one. But the problem is that's not true. So when you look at a mature yellow tomato, it has actually a remarkable, similarly profile in terms of acidity and sweetness than a red fruit does. And I'll show you why in a minute. But so you have to take some of these things with a bit of a grain of salt. Some of the things on this table are actually are actually true. Like with the plums, looking across, plums do tend to have a much lower water content, and they tend to have a chewy texture. That's true, but that's a generalization. A lot of tomatoes do have that. Minis, especially the grape tomatoes, they tend to be, I'm not going to say high water, but they definitely are sweeter. And they're usually sweeter because of the particular sugars that actually are typically in grape tomatoes. Grape tomatoes have a lot of fructose in them. And for the human tongue, fructose tastes sweeter than glucose. So that's why we're sort of fooling our tongues. So, but there actually may be the same amount of sugar in there, it's just different sugars. So tangy, we talk about harvesting a green tomato. It's low sugar, high acidity. That's correct. So, and that's reason is because you've harvested it when it's mature green typically. So that's why those numbers look like that. But really, when you start looking at these other things, when they talk about balanced sugar or balanced acidity, they're really not very true. You know, they're very subjective. So, and they're really related to the tomatoes you might be trying and the taster. So now what I'm trying to do is show you how to sort of remove some of the subjectiveness. So, and how you can actually figure out, well, how can I figure out the best time to actually harvest my tomatoes? All right. The USDA recognizes 6 different stages of tomato maturity. The first one I mentioned, I think there's a laser pointer on here. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. The first one, this is the mature green, all right? This is USDA stage number 1. And this is the point where the fruit, like I said, it's got good gel formation. When you do the knife test, you don't cut the seeds and things like that. And they'll mature naturally. They will ripen naturally, simply not attached to the plant. And that's what the Florida industry and California, Arizona, that's what they geared on. The rest of these are all considered vine ripe. You know, whether you're harvesting at the breaker stage or one of the pink stage or the red, these are all considered vine ripe by the USDA. So if you actually, if you go online and you type in USDA tomato fruit grades, a publication will come up and it will describe in way more detail than you want all of this, as well as having pictures. So, but what's interesting about all these is obviously as you go from stage 1 down to 6, flavor changes significantly. So in these things, so and there's a reason why that actually happens. So, and it's got to do with the ripening process. All right, this is probably the most complicated graph I'm going to show you, but don't worry about that. There's two black lines on here. Ignore those. Just pretend they're not there, okay? So looking across here, but problem is I couldn't remove the stupid things trying to edit this table. So, but anyway, ignore those. But here's mature green. Here's the advancing stage of growth. So acidity decreases as fruit mature and ripens, and sweetness increases as the fruit ripens. That's true. For all the tomato varieties we typically grow, that's true. So, and what you see is, in this line, this green line, this is short. This is time, so increasing time, so it's ripening, and this is a relative value, meaning it increases as you go up in the y-axis here. So, but green color, acidity, starchiness, flesh firmness, insoluble pectins, those are what ends up forming those nice gels inside the fruit. They become soluble pectins, and these phenolic compounds, these simple phenolics, that's what the aroma actually comes from. In tomatoes, there's actually, depending on the variety you're looking at, there's 15 or 20 of these phenolics that actually influence the aroma that you interpret when you smell these things. So as the tomato matures, as it ripens, what happens is the red color or yellow color or whatever color begins developing on it. The aromas increase, okay, because these phenolics that were simple here, they become polymerized. They basically start binding together. Flavors, sugars, soluble pectins, all those things increase. So there's a lot of difference in terms of chemically what's happening in the tomato from this point over this way. You know, and if you're also to list flavor is increasing as you go this way. So with the fruit, so. All right. We talk a lot about the various chemical compounds in tomatoes, and one that you notice in the, that you're going to find online, you're going to see a lot of things online actually regarding carotenoids. There's a lot of them have been making the news because they offer some potential health benefits for humans. So especially with beta-carotene, lycopene, we talk a lot about prostate health issues, as well as some potential benefits with, many other benefits that unfortunately they're not really proven yet, but there's an awful lot of things listed online when you read some of the potential health benefits of these. But when you look at color in tomato, color is the key component that influences the consumer's initial perception of the quality and for the growers as well. So in tomato, so that's the first thing that we key into. So it's not taste, it's what its appearance, it's what it looks like. So it behooves you, if I'm growing for a farmer's market, I want my fruit to have as much color as you possibly can get it. Well, of course, some people like to buy fruit that are at breaker stage so they're going to mature a little bit later on during, to use. But for eye appeal, that's critical. Obviously, the fruit needs to look fairly uniform. It's got to have really good color, really deep color. And in tomatoes, most of the color comes from the reds and oranges, and then yellows come from a group of chemicals called carotenoids. So this is just a group of chemicals out there that in the plant, they actually protect the plant from excessive light. So, and damage that could come from excessive light. So that's where some of the ideas behind, where some of these may help in terms of you fight free radicals from, damage that may happen to your cells. But in case of tomatoes, lycopene, beta-carotene, and xanthophylls all help protect the plant from excessive light. Lycopene is the first one. They basically all get generated from a set of common compounds. Lycopene is formed first. It's the bright red pigment. It makes up 90% of the color, typically the red color in tomatoes. Beta-carotene is the red-orange pigment. This is also a precursor to vitamin A. The lycopene itself and beta-carotene are not vitamins, so but in the case of beta-carotene, it's a precursor to vitamin A. And the xanthophylls. Xanthophylls the beta-carotene goes through another set of chemical reactions, and it'll form these xanthophylls. And the xanthophylls were to make yellows in the fruit. But what's interesting is people will look at this and they'll say, wow, that's a really red fruit. It tastes better, and I think it tastes better because it's red. That's not true. Humans cannot taste these compounds. We lack the receptors in our tongue for these carotenoids and flavonoids, so they don't affect taste, at least for humans. Anyway, so color doesn't influence flavor for humans. So what color does is obviously it gives us a positive perception of what that tomato looks like and what we think it's going to taste like when we actually harvest it. Obviously, with tomatoes, there's lots of other colors out there as well. A lot of the heirlooms, we have tomatoes that are almost pitch black, that really dark purple color, and that comes from another group of compounds called anthocyanins. These may sound like fancy words that aren't common in everyday life, but any of the flowers that you grow, any of the trees that are out there, the yellows in the trees are from xanthophylls. A lot of the other darker colors are from anthocyanins. So these are common compounds located through nature. So it's just tomatoes happen to make use of this set for the color of the particular fruit. But anthocyanins are blues, reds, purples, and blacks typically. It depends on the pH within the fruit of actually what's expressed, what the color is actually going to look like ultimately. And that's obviously distinctive. So one thing I think is sort of interesting about this group, these are called flavonoids. These also help to regulate cellular activity in a tomato and help fight off some of these potential free radical damage from too much sunlight, from overpowering the plant. So there's a lot of obviously similar sort of roles that both of these coloring agents, their pigments actually do play in the tomato. So these really don't contribute to taste. However, in some varieties, especially some of the old heirloom varieties, they do. And it actually lends a sort of a bitter, almost astringent kind of taste. And that's very variety specific. But generally speaking, these really don't reflect, really don't affect flavor at all, with some exceptions. So here again, more involvement with fruit color. Perception is the key thing here. Obviously, we want our consumers to like what they're seeing, but it really doesn't play a major impact on flavor. So sort of going back to this, again, when we talk about maximizing the shelf life, so like I said, we talk about shelf life, we talk about maturity. Maturity is really the point in the tomato where you can detach it from the plant and it still matures by itself and it will still ripen normally by itself. But you have to remember, as the sweetness and acidity, a lot of times we sit there going, well, it's just sweet or it's just this, but it's actually a lot more than that. It's a lot more complicated than that. What it ends up looking like, at least in terms of our, when we taste things, is we do interpret, how do we interpret, or maybe I should say, how as a grower is this even useful for me? How is knowing it, about sweetness or acidity in the tomato fruit? Well, we can measure those things. So, and the nice thing is on tomatoes, we can measure sweetness pretty easily. So we use a device. Has anybody ever seen one of these? It's called a refractometer. So if you happen to be, if you have honeybees and you have honey, or if you grow wine, do wine and things like that, refractometers are pretty commonly used. So, but a refractometer measures something called soluble solids, and it's an indirect measure of sweetness. So it actually gives you an idea of how sweet something particularly is. If I'm a watermelon grower, typically, I've got one of these in my back pocket because I'm going to periodically go through to figure out when my watermelons are ready, not necessarily by the calendar days, but by when the sweetness begins to really increase. And watermelons, we're hoping to get 10 to 11 to 12% bricks, the measurement unit that's used on these things, for it to be a sweet watermelon. We can use the same device on tomatoes. So because the soluble solids is correlated positively with the sweetness of the fruit. So it's an indirect measurement, but it's a really nice tool, especially for growing a variety we've never grown before. This particular one I've got in my hand was about $40. I got it from Amazon. So for usually less than $50, you can get a lot of useful information. What you do is you cut the fruit, and it looks like a little ocular. You look through here, it almost looks like looking through a little telescope, and I'll pass this around so you can all see it. You take a couple of drops of the fluid from the tomato, you put it on there, you close this, you look through it, and you'll see a scale. When this comes around to you, look through there, and you'll see a scale on there, and that's going to actually give you a measurement. It's called degrees bricks. So, but obviously, the higher that number is, the sweeter or whatever it is. If I'm a soda manufacturer, I use one of these. So, there's a lot of reasons why these are used, and they're very useful. The biggest thing with these is try not to scratch the plate and don't drop it, because just like any other sort of implement, it's got optics in it, and if you drop it, that's usually the end of it. So, but anyway. And also, this is also going to be a door prize, so one of you may be lucky to actually come home with this thing. So, all right, I'll start. Yeah.
Does that stay calibrated, or does it be recalibrated over time?
Generally, they do. Some of them are designed that you can make some calibration changes on it, but most of them are not. That particular one is basically, it comes as it is. If it starts acting odd, or the numbers don't seem to make sense, there's like stock solutions you can buy to test it. They make digital ones that are really cool that you have to calibrate, but they're also $300 typically to start with. So, but anyway, but generally this type doesn't need to be calibrated. So, but one thing that's nice is after a couple of years is I have a tendency to just toss it and buy a new one just to make sure it's working okay. So, all right. The other thing what we can measure in tomatoes is the acidity, and again it's sort of an indirect measurement. What we can do is we measure something called the titratable acidity. So. And what we find is we can actually physically measure that with a pH meter. So we extract the juice, we go through a small process. Most of you are not going to have the time to do that. So, but you can actually buy kits that do this. So you can buy a kit that actually has a refractometer in it as well as a pH meter and the other things you need to measure the titratable acidity. But again, it's sort of an indirect measurement of the total acidity in the fruit. But these two factors are measurable. These are two things that you can do. Especially with the refractometer, sweetness is a really good measurement, and I'll show you why it's a really good measurement. You have to, now I'm going to show this for a second, make sure you memorize it. So,
Joe, a couple of things. For the benefit of our virtual audience, if you get a question, could you repeat the question?
oh, sure. So.
And then secondly, hold the mic a little bit
Oh,
closer.
sorry. There we go. So, do you want me to repeat the question about the refractometer? They got, okay. So anyway, looking at this is some survey work that a colleague did at University of Tennessee, and what she did was she took this is just a portion of the data, but she evaluated slicer tomatoes, red fruited slicer tomatoes, and she did this over a course of a couple of years, and she did a lot, and what they were doing is they were looking at the peak ripeness of the fruit, and what she did was she measured the soluble solids with a meter like I just showed you, and then she measured titratable acidity, those two factors I mentioned. And what you typically see here is there's not a lot of differences when you sort of boil it down. So, and when you do a survey across all the different types of tomato varieties that are out there, and I look through some literature to get some ideas of sort of the range of these things, what you typically see is they're fairly stable. They don't differ a lot. So what does that mean is, are some tomatoes more acidic than others? Probably not. Are they sweeter than others? Probably not. So they actually have they have a tendency to be remarkably close, with some exceptions. The grapes and the cherry tomatoes, as a group, tend to be sweeter. They tend to either have a higher glucose content or a higher fructose content, and some of that's just simply due to the size of the fruit. You may get the same amount of sugar produced in a small fruit compared to a large fruit. So the concentration doesn't change. The difference is that one's a tiny fruit, so it's more concentrated, one's a large fruit. So the sweetness is actually spread out through the whole fruit. But when you do this survey looking across at different varieties like the grape tomatoes and cherries and things, you typically see is they really don't vary a whole lot within the group. So the acidity tends to be about the same, the soluble solids tend to be about the same. What becomes important here is really this, the sugar-acid ratio. The sugar-to-acid ratio increases as the fruit ripens. So what that means is the sugars go up and the acidity goes down, but you hit a maximum point, and that's what this is. This is basically, it's not going to change any more than this. So if I'm growing some tomato varieties that I've never grown before and I'm not really sure the best time to harvest it, using a refractometer, and when the number gets up someplace in that 3.5 to 4.5 range, you're probably at maximum. You're probably not going to get any sweeter than what that is. So that is a nice tool you can use to sort of figure out, are you close, but you will see some differences between varieties. Again, this is sort of these numbers represent averages of a lot of different varieties, so really a lot of extensive work that people have done. But it's what I think is so interesting is how stable these numbers really tend to be across the group of tomatoes in general. So, but what we find is in tomatoes that the sugar-to-acid ratio is more important than the amount of sugar or the amount of acid by itself. And that ratio increases, the sugar increases, but we hit a maximum. So, the acids are only going to get so low in that 0.3% kind of range. The sweetness is only going to get up in that 3.5 to 4.5%, sometimes a little bit higher in some of the other varieties. The aromatic volatiles, which I haven't really mentioned because, frankly, the chemistry becomes it's just unuseful to look at it. So it's not to know that the fact that there's a lot of chemicals that you smell, these phenolic compounds that you smell, that influences flavor. That influences the perception of what you think this is going to taste like. So you may have a tomato that's got a good sugar-to-acid ratio, and maybe, but it's got a really awful aromatic volatile profile. You ever have some tomatoes that taste musky? That muskiness, that's actually a specific gene that does that. So that's endemic in some of the old-time varieties that we grow. So it's not your fault, it's not the tomato's fault, but that's just part of its genetics. So that muskiness. So there are all flavors that actually are out there, but it's part of that profile of these aromatic volatiles. The best way to maximize that content of volatiles is harvesting a ripe fruit. And obviously the further along you are on that USDA list, when you get towards the pink stage and the light red and the red stage, those volatiles are usually maximized. They're usually at the peak levels. They're not going to change a whole lot. What's going to happen is when it becomes overripened, those volatiles begin decreasing and things break down in the fruit. So if you're looking for just a basic tool, a simple refractometer isn't a bad way to do that. So, and again, you can actually measure this titratable acidity with a kit, but it's probably more work than most growers really want to deal with. It's a nice tool for researchers. So I guess if you're trying to think about flavor, like I said, you think back to that chart I showed you with the different varieties out there, with the yellows and things like that, with those sort of profiles we talk about, about one variety versus another variety. They just don't hold very well, so unfortunately. So I wish they did. I wish they said, oh yeah, yellow tomatoes are always low acid. That's simply not true. So they're all very similar in terms of the acid content. It's those phenolics, those volatile, those are aromatic compounds. Those are what tend to really influence the flavor of whatever it is you're tasting. So yeah, sugar and acids are important. But there's a whole lot more obviously to taste than just those two things. Color, like I said, may not be a good indicator of flavor, but it certainly helps in terms of figuring out maturity and the ripeness of the fruit. But again, you really have to understand the particular variety you're growing for you to figure out, is this the maximum color that I typically get from that variety? So that's sort of important to know. And again, one red tomato is not the same as the one next to it. So, you can't always depend just on that one or two characteristics to figure out when is the best time to harvest these things. Again, acidity decreases as the fruit ripens, the sweetness begins increasing. So if somebody said, hey, when is the best, if I want a really acid tomato, when's the best time to pick it? When you look at that chart I showed you here, this is the mature green stage, this is going into the red stage. And again, acidity is at a peak here and it goes down here. So, but obviously this is red ripe. This is sort of the breaker stage here. So if I'm looking for a tomato that's got a high acid content, a really high acid content, I'm going to harvest it here. So at that, the breaker stage, or the mature green stage, that's the highest acid content. So that's why I said, sometimes it's a little confusing for these things. We try to generalize these things, but unfortunately, a lot of these tomatoes simply don't fit well in those categories. With aroma increases as you go across here. This simple sounding name, these simple phenolics, they get convert it into these other form, and it makes a more complex flavor, and it obviously that adds a more complex taste to what you're dealing with. So when we do taste tests, typically we'll lay them out like this. People will try it. We get the best data when we actually blindfold people, when they can't actually see the color. That gives us a lot better objective data. But when people see it, we've noticed that people will make assumption about what that tomato should taste like. If it's red, it has a better flavor. If it's yellow, it's probably not going to have as good a flavor as the red one. Or if you look at some of these other ones, these greens and others, so there's a lot of colors out there, you know, black crimson and things like that. So when we show it to them, they make the assumption it's not going to taste as good. Or conversely, you also get growers who'll say that all I do is grow heirlooms, so the funkier it looks, the better it's going to taste. But when we blindfold people and they truly just taste it with their palate, you know, and their nose, we get a much better data in terms of what they look like. You know, and it usually diverges completely from what they saw when they saw it with their eyes. It's really pretty fascinating. So perception is obviously key. We want our tomatoes to look absolute best, you know, so if you as a grower, your best thing is, all right, if I want my tomatoes to taste the best, I'm going to harvest them as close to red as I possibly can. So the longer they're sitting on the vine, the more chance you give it for all these flavonoids, all these flavor compounds to actually begin to developing and to have a really full profile in that taste. Some varieties, there's an old-time variety, mortgage lifter. Has anybody ever grown it? So it's a Rin hybrid. It's a ripening inhibited. It never develops a red color. It gets sort of that orangey, kind of yellowy color. You get very poor internal color. That's one of those tomatoes that has that muskiness gene in it. So that's why it doesn't really taste that right. Yeah, it's a tomato, but it looks a lot like the ones you get from Florida in the wintertime, you know, so that have been gassed, you know, even though it's a fresh tomato, and you can grow it and it'll stay in your basement for months without rotting. So, but that doesn't mean you should eat it. So that's always the thing. So there's a lot of tomato varieties. There are thousands of tomato varieties out there. So if I'm trying to come up with something unique or unusual, try several varieties. Grow a handful. Try new varieties every single year they're actually growing, because there's a lot of tastes and things like that. And what you may find, you know, for yourselves, you may find some tastes that you like better. So, but you know, giving that recommendation of this one's more acidic or this one's, you know, less acidic, that's a challenge. You know, like I said, you really, unless you harvest it a little bit early, you know, it's simply not true, because most of the tomatoes all have a very similar acid content in it. So what's really affecting it are those volatiles. So that's really what's making the major influence on the taste. So when you're looking at flavor, it's variety. It's that sugar-acid ratio, and it's also the sugars that actually do form in that fruit. Again, if I'm growing grape tomatoes and some cherry tomatoes, a lot of them have fructose. And fructose is simply, you know, when we eat grape tomatoes, it's like eating candy, because fructose is sweeter to the human palate than glucose is and some other sugars. So sometimes it's a bit of a trick. Obviously, those aromatic volatiles that form affect flavor and ultimately age. You know, as the plant matures and ripeness begins to develop, that's where you're really maximizing the yield. So if I have a farmer's market and I'm picking here and I'm selling right here, that's probably the best of all worlds. Or if I have a CSA, you know, so this kind of, you know, thinking about flavor and maximizing that really helps you figure out when is really the best time to put those tomatoes in that box. So maybe you need to wait another day, or maybe you need to back up a day or two from what you've normally done. But tomatoes, I think tomato flavor is pretty complicated. One thing I will say about the carotenoids, so I mentioned, like I said, that the carotenoids, the beta-carotene gets converted into vitamin A ultimately, and that has a taste. You can actually influence taste with vitamin A. Actually has a physical taste to it, so not much, but it can contribute to the overall sort of factor. So the carotenoids, the color you're looking at, typically is influencing the taste, but it's what they get converted into ultimately. So after they change. So that all makes sense? I know that's probably an awful lot to get started with the first thing in the morning, but flavor's complicated. When people ask me constantly, say, Joe, what's the best variety to grow for being acidic? I give them this answer, and then they don't ask me questions anymore. So because I wish, you know, the problem is the more you know, the more complicated things typically get, and that's sort of how I look at this. So, but what I do say is, all varieties are unique. You know, I mean, I know growers, I know breeders that I've worked with. My background's in tomato breeding, and when we would do work, you know, we tried to be as objective as we possibly can, and it was a challenge. So to do that, but you know, we tried to come up with consensus. But so even with working with a breeder, he had an idea of what a tomato should taste like, which didn't always mesh with what I thought a tomato should taste like, because I grew up in New Jersey, and we have a certain expectation of what a tomato should taste like there, versus he was in North Carolina and he had his version of what they should taste like. And the best way to really come up with a compromise was these blindfold testing, which obviously most people are not going to do, but it gives us the most objective data when we're actually looking at varieties. And when we do look at varieties like that, we see less sort of, we see personal preferences that simply come out. And there's some chemicals that some people are, you ever heard the term super tasters rather? So people who have a remarkably defined palate that food companies and people who develop food products love to have these people involved with them, because they're able to pick up very subtle nuances within things like that. So if you have somebody like that working with you, they can pick up some of these individual tones and compounds in the fruit. So, but obviously most of us can't do that. So sometimes it comes down to what you like. And sometimes what you like may not necessarily be what the other person likes. That's always a challenge. So you try to split the difference. You do everything you could possibly can to pick it at the right time. You try to make sure it's got the full amount of sugar it should particularly have, for that particular point of maturity. You try to make sure it's in good shape, it's in good quality, there's no defects or things like that. That's really the best you can do. And then when you hit a variety that's just awful, don't grow it anymore. I like holding on to old things too, but there are some tomato varieties that are simply awful. Honestly, they're just absolutely terrible. So, and I just wonder why anyone would propagate this thing and maintain it. So, but it's an heirloom, and we need to hold it. But it doesn't mean it's all bad. But I'm sure there's somebody out there somewhere that actually does like it. Ultimately, though, that's sort of talking about the inside components of the tomato. But one of the other things we have to think about is when we actually physically harvest it. So this is harvesting down in Florida, and I love to show this picture because they're dropping those tomatoes 4 or 5 feet from where he's holding that bin down to the bottom, and they're bouncing. So that's why those tomatoes you buy in the wintertime taste the way they do. They're small softballs, that can tolerate being bounced around. So it's hard to develop good flavor in this case. They're tomatoes, they're reddish, they're round or globe-shaped, but taste is a problem. So, but you as a grower, normally most of you are fairly small grower operations. You can, a lot of things you're going to do are going to be hand harvesting. Hand harvesting is the best way to maintain quality. Picking individual fruits off them like that. And obviously not dropping them like this. But rapid cooling is key in tomatoes. One thing I've seen growers do in the past that's a real no-no with tomatoes are dipping them in cold water. Never, ever do that. So the tomatoes can be cooled with water, but normally you want the temperature of the water, if you're going to put it in water to disinfect it and clean it off, you actually want the water to be the same temperature as the pulp. So if it's 90 degrees outside, the pulp is probably close to 90 degrees. You want the water to be 90 degrees. If you take a tomato that's hot and you dump it in cold water, it has a tendency to act like a sponge. So if there's rotting organisms in the water and other problems like that, they can actually get sucked into the fruit. So this is also a food safety issue as well, obviously. So make sure you get the fruit out of the sun. Never use contact icing or dumping them in water. And pre-cooling, that's just a way of removing field heat. And in the case of a lot of tomato growers, it may just be you taking the tomatoes in your truck and parking it under shade or putting a tarp on top of it. So anything you could do, remember that tomato's been disconnected from the plant, so it's not receiving any additional water, so it's dehydrating. So the longer it sits there in the sun, it stresses and it's losing water weight. And as soon as it loses water weight, that's when it begins to decompose a little bit more quickly than you want it to. And it also begins affecting flavor. So, and all those things that you don't want it to affect. So get it out of the sun as quickly as you can. Like I said, you can wash tomatoes. Most growers don't do this in the Southeast unless I've got an operation like this that I'm growing a large acreage and I'm growing them for the mature green market where I'm going to take them and gas them. So, but again, you can disinfect them. We do have people now, because of food safety concerns, that will actually use either chlorinated water or another disinfectant to actually spray the crop, to make sure it's clean, and that's certainly doable. But you have to make sure you do it correctly. So, and you have to make sure, there's a lot of instructions to follow with this particular with the process. So, when you room cooling is probably the most common thing, where you take it and you put it in a room that's 55 degrees. That's probably the most common thing. But if on large scale, even on small scale, we can do it. We do something called forced air cooling, and that's where we'll actually stack all the tomatoes like in a U shape. We'll put a tarp over it, and then we put a fan on the front where the tarp's coming out, and we will blow air through there. So that's called forced air cooling, and that actually helps remove the field heat much more rapidly than just simply room cooling. Taking it and sticking it in a room, so versus pulling air across it. So it's actually very effective. But those are the two that's the two methods of cooling tomatoes that we recommend. Remember, never, ever, ever any contact icing. The USDA says that we can store tomatoes at various different temperatures depending on how ripe they are. But really what it comes down to, anybody who's ever seen a tomato box, it'll say on the side of it, do not store below 55 degrees. That's really the industry standard. But the more ripe they are, you can store them longer, but at reduced storage temperatures, the shelf life goes down. So if I've got like a red ripe fruit, I can store it down to 40 to 45 degrees. I've got significantly shorter shelf life on it, and I'm also going to have a tendency to develop off flavors a lot more quickly if the storage conditions aren't perfect. So you can do it, but again, usually this is only done for marketing. You know, most of the people in here who are growing for retail sales, you're not worried about this. So, but if you're going to store them, you know, make sure you never store them below 55 degrees. All right, so that's probably more than you want to know about flavor. So does anybody have any questions or comments, or? It makes perfect sense. So flavor's a lot to think about. Like I said, it's easy. It's whenever people come at me and they show me one of those tables saying, well, this variety is supposed to be the best, I say, how do you base that? You know, what's the basis of that? So it's become, unfortunately, the older I've gotten, the more complicated the situations become, the more I read about it. Yeah.
What about the complexity of your soil? Does that affect flavor?
Anything that could potentially impact on 5 minutes? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. How does soil condition affect flavor? Right. Right. Anything that could potentially negatively affect the nutrition of the crop is going to affect the maturity of the crop. You know, so everything you do as a grower, whether organic or unconventional, all the things you've got to do is to optimize my soil health. I have to optimize the amount of water I put out there. Any of the fertilizers you put out there, whether they're organic or inorganic, when it comes down to it, the plant really doesn't care where it comes from. You know, what's important is it has enough, you know, to actually meet the, so when it comes to those kind of issues, you know, anything you do to improve it, you know, especially in Alabama, we have a lot of very heavy clay soils that frankly are tired, they're exhausted. You know, we can still get decent yields at it, but the more we do in terms of adding organic matter and using cover crops and things like that, we always get better results over time. It may take 10 years, but it will take some time. So soil health is certainly something that has to be paid attention to. So if anything is off, you know, you may not be getting when it comes down to it, you may not get the production you need to get out of it. But flavor, if everything is there, the flavor should be the same. You just may not have enough fruit, or they may be smaller, you know, if the soil health isn't really where it needs to be. Anyone else? Is anybody going to run out and buy a refractometer? So you're going to get one? So where's it at? Did everybody get a chance to look at it? So yeah, so like I said, it's a useful tool. A lot of growers, like I said, will just have one of those in their back pocket or have it on their truck. Yeah.
Would you comment on the difference between digital and analog?
Yeah, that's an analog measurement. You know, when you all look through that, you saw the scale on there. There was like, you know, from I think that one said 8 to 20 or 8 to 15. So, and it's analog, obviously, and you hold it up to sunlight, and you'll get a little measurement of where, you know, a line that will form. But analog is cheaper. They tend not to break as often unless you drop them, like I've done occasionally. Digital's nice because if I'm doing, like, if I'm in the field and I'm doing a lot of measurements with refractometers, digital's nice because it's quick. I don't have to keep cleaning everything off and going through it. But the difference is price. You know, one single digital refractometer is about $300. That's 45. So a big difference in price, and they give you the same data. So. Yeah, you could find it cheaper. The couple that I have now, I found that there's some, at least for some of the digital ones, reliability is an issue, and also the ability. The $300 ones are ones that you can, for refractometers, are ones that I can go through and make sure that they're reading accurately. I can go through and calibrate them periodically. So you can buy cheaper ones that you can't calibrate. You just throw them away when they stop working. So. All right. Thank you. So.